I first met Henry Mollicone very early on in my tenure as president of the New England Conservatory. This was in 1967. The school, which at one time, the New England Conservatory of Music, had been the leading music conservatory school in the United States for many, many years. And then somewhere in the 50s or so on, it began to fall on bad times. And the school was going to go bankrupt financially, and it also was bankrupt educationally because when the enrollment of the school, which had been for decades and decades 715 students, it was down to something like 245. You couldn't even have a chorus with that or an orchestra. So it was finished. And I was called in to rescue the school, which I did eventually with the help of some wonderful people at the conservatory. So in 1967, I came there with this. I'm a high school dropout. I didn't even know what an undergraduate degree was, for God's sakes. And I walk into this maelstrom of problems, and I was so innocent and stupid that I didn't even know what to ask what the finances of the school were. I found that out once I had accepted the presidency. I was recommended by Copeland and William Schumann and all kinds of people. So, and I was already at Tanglewood, and so I came there. And I met all the faculty, of course, very soon. And there were two people that became particularly interested in. By the way, I had to build up the composition department. He was a student at the time when I got there. I had, because it had come down in number, and I felt that my whole philosophy, the basic ingredient philosophy about reviving the school and at the same time kind of getting it to a higher level of creativity, was to have the composition department be the center of the school, not the performance department. That's Juilliard. That's what they do, and Curtis. And that's fine. But this is something else. So by the time I got through with the saving of the school, I'm bragging a lot about myself to begin with. No, I'm not bragging. It's true. I had 17 composers on the faculty, including jazz composers, and and even one jazz theorist, of which there aren't any. and and so I got as a composer, of course, this was my main interest, and I got involved, and I met Henry and his teacher, and Danny Pinkham was an amazing figure because he composed so much wonderful music, and very prolific and very facile, and almost always, well, I don't want to use the word perfect, but it always worked, no matter what he wrote. I mean, madrigals or an oratorio or a symphonic piece or whatever. And Henry was his major student at the time. And Henry is sort of an offspring of Pinkham. And what I should say, to just put this all in context now, I am a composer, and I am of that sort. They're very much, what's the word, disliked composers that are 12-tone composers, and very much vilified forever, still to this day, considered the ruination of music and all of that. And of course, Daniel and Enrico are, well, I won't say light years, but very much removed from the kind of music I like. I write. I misspoke now, because what is interesting about me, I believe, and a lot of people know this, I have a very open mind about all kinds of music styles, and what I admired in this music that Pinkham and Mollicone wrote was even though it was far away from my own conception of writing music, was so well made and so attractive. And you know, it's not wrong to be attractive. It's not always so easy, especially if you write in a style which people inherently call unattractive to begin with, you know. But anyway, that's my issue. So that's how I got to know him, and he's such a nice fellow also. And I think some of the more modernistic inclined composers and teachers in the school at that time, they sort of wondered how this Gunther Schuller, famous 12-tone composer, you know, had such a friendship with Henry. I ignored such feelings, of course. And so we became pretty good friends. And then he left quite soon, and he went, I guess, directly to California. Yeah. And then, you know, he was on his own, and he's been, I haven't been in touch with him much. We haven't been in touch with each other maybe once every 2 or 3 years, but it's someone I still admire very much, and I'm very, I was happy on this, in the context of this occasion, to become a little bit more familiar with his more recent music, because I haven't really kept up with everything. He's also very, very prolific, I think, isn't he? Prodigious, yes.
Yeah. Well, you've heard The Face on the Barroom Floor?
Yeah, sure.
Tell me about your feelings about it, your observances about this.
Well, in essence, it's what I just said. I mean, this is not something that I would ever write. But look, because I'm also, I'm not a famous conductor, but I'm a major conductor. I've conducted every kind of classical music for years and years with all the famous orchestras of the world, except the Vienna Philharmonic or 1 or 2 others. But anyway, so therefore both as a student of the classical tradition and as a performer of it to this day, I mean, thousands of performances of Beethoven symphonies or whatever, or Wagner or Strauss or whatever, I am in love with that whole wonderful 200 or 300 tradition from Bach on, even before that, by the way. But anyway, at least from Bach on. And so, you know, the neoclassic movement to which Pinkham and Henry belong was one of the latest manifestation of this development of music through the centuries. And, you know, I was an atonal composer, and they were in this neoclassics, the leaders of which were Stravinsky and Copland. The leaders of the other school were Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, and then later Babbitt and Carter and all kinds of other people. So there's this wide range of music, you know. And people are always amazed that I have such a understanding of, or sympathy for, or whatever, empathy for this other music, because you may not know this, people may not know this, this world, this composition world, is very severely divided. And it's like the Republicans and Democrats right now. They don't talk to each other. They vilify, they hate each other. It was even worse in the 40s and 50s, but now there's some kind of understanding of coexistence. And but anyway, in that context, the audience, you know, audiences, record collectors, and so on, they're not aware of this strife between these two musical styles and worlds, but in the music world, people know this. So as I say, they often wonder how Gunther is so wide-ranging, and a lot of it has to do just with my deep involvement with classical music to begin with, and then jazz, which until very recently was also in a rather traditional language. I mean, the most advanced harmonies in jazz in the so-called bebop era, which was a whole modern development, right? But it still was the language, the harmonic language, a chromatic language that Debussy and Ravel used. So that, you know, that isn't atonal. So even jazz was in a pretty traditional language. So all of that makes me, in my philosophy, feel, look, there's all these different composers, and I don't care what style they write in. if they do it well, if it's intelligent, if it's made well, and it has all the qualities of a good piece of music, which has to do with form and harmonic language and melodic language. Just do it well, and I don't care if you write eventually only in C major, but if you can do that very excitingly and well, so be it. And not many people can get their minds around these different areas, but I enjoy that. And as a conductor, I feel that I must do that in order to represent the whole world of music, not just one arena or something, you know. And Henry is one of those talented guys. He writes damn well. That opera, "A Face on the Barroom Floor," as I listen to it again now, I just sat there. You know, this is damn good. I mean, in its way, it's not what I would do, and so what? But in its way, it's all perfectly made.
What do you feel about an opera in terms? You're also a businessman. You own a record company. You make a living.
Yeah.
Feel about an opera that's made consisting of 3 instrumentalists, 3 singers that can be literally performed in any bar on the universe.
Yeah, I would call all of that genius, or very close to it. I mean, that's really, yeah, I should have mentioned that. That's really remarkable, and how much he produced, how much expression and telling, of course, that whole tale, that whole story, and how well to do that with such essentially limited forces. But he proves that it need not be limited. You know, that's a real talent.
Sounds like grand opera.
Yeah, yeah.
Throw some Puccini in just to make sure you know it.
Yeah. I should not fail to mention that I also conducted at Central City for several seasons. Yeah, this is maybe 25, 30 years ago now, and I was in that bar. So I knew about that. You know, you can't go to Central City and not hear about that whole tale. It's just fascinating that Henry picked up on that and did something with it. But, you know, we all go there and we hear about it, you know, and the guided tours and whatnot. And as we live there for 3 or 4 weeks, you hear about this legend all the time. And so but I had not known for a while that Henry had written an opera about this thing. I've mentioned that there's this thing called neoclassical music. Now, what I have to go back a little bit to put this in context. Music developed from, let's say, Bach's already highly vigorous chromaticism through the classical period, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and then into the Romantics, and finally into Wagner, who created this incredible, it's a quantum leap forward in terms of what we call chromaticism. And that finally became atonal music in the first decade of the 20th century with Schoenberg and those composers. They came out of Wagner and Brahms. And then that was such the Rite of Spring, and let's say one of Schoenberg's operas, one of his greatest masterpieces, very not performed that much. It's an opera called Erwartung, Expectations. Those were the 2 most breakthrough pieces. The Rite of Spring is still one of the most inexplicably great pieces that just moved music forward dramatically. What happened, however, and that was in 1910 to 1913, so on. And what happened was that both of those composers and many of their followers suddenly realized that in this new world of atonality, and there were no rules anymore, no rules of behavior as there were in tonal music, which Wagner had nibbled at more and more, and these rules began to be sort of either broken down or moved forward in some way. So I'm trying to make this as short as possible, but what happened was that they both, and this is evident in the next musics that they wrote, they were kind of perplexed. How do we go on from here? My God, I can't. This new vista of music that I see out there, Schoenberg would say to himself, I don't know how to control it, how to govern it the way we did in classical music, you know, and in terms of forms and continuity, it was unoverseeable. And guess what? They both went backwards. Next piece that Stravinsky wrote was Histoire du Soldat, which is the beginning of what we then called neoclassicism. This was Berg's music is one that where the tonal, you can always hear still the tonal background. Schoenberg tried to eliminate that pretty radically. But anyway, Schoenberg began to use classical forms and call pieces, you know, gavottes and whatnot. And he thought, and also, and not just in the names, but in the forms. And he thought that this connection to earlier musical styles, Baroque and whatever, might help the listener to get through with this atonal music. It didn't work too well, you know, and he never was really became that. In fact, the reaction to that was still, you know, considerable vilification about Schoenberg most of the time, which made him eventually a very bitter man. I can sympathize with him. I got to know him at the end of his life. So anyway, so now we're in the time of World War II, and now neoclassicism comes in and make a big jump forward. It now takes over the musical world, and this atonal stuff is sort of put on the sidelines and more or less rejected. Now we get into the time of World War II, and right after that, in 1953, Stravinsky, the major leader of the neoclassic style, and by the way, he wrote 30 fantastic masterpieces in that style, having already created maybe the greatest pieces of all in a whole other style, the Rite of Spring. Anyway, he was convinced by one of his, a young composer, Robert Kraft, who went out to kind of be with Stravinsky and convinced him that that the 12-tone style had really been the right solution at that time and should be continued. And he convinced Stravinsky, who then became a 12-tone composer the rest of his life. Well, that caused such consternation in this well-built-up neoclassic world. And Nadia Boulanger and Copland, I mean, they almost committed suicide when Igor, you're leaving us. How can you do this? You know, and I mean, and as you mentioned, what happened within a year or two, suddenly, you couldn't get a job unless you were a Webern-like composer or atonal. Webern was one of the more interesting of the three of the so-called Second Viennese School. So suddenly, everything turned towards atonality, and that lasted for about 5 or 10 years. And that style eventually burned itself out by getting into such, you know, and I'm an atonal composer, so this carries some weight when I say this, that led to such extremism and such almost, I never want to say that something is completely unplayable, but virtually unplayable, so that composers, musicians began to rebel at this extremism. And this was the time of Darmstadt and Donaueschingen and these modern festivals with composers like Boulez and Stockhausen and Nono and so on. And suddenly the whole world changed. And suddenly, you know, the Danny Pinkhams and the Henry Mollicones were on the outside, whereas previously they had been, of course, in. This is before Henry's time, of course, that I'm talking about. So anyway, and then I remember predicting at Tanglewood, because I did all the contemporary music there, and I saw all these developments and uh, uh, and I predicted that this whole atonal 12-tone business, which led to serialism, which is serializing all the elements of music, not just the pitches, but the rhythms, the dynamics, everything is numerically controlled. That led to a kind of what we call in German Augenmusik, eye music, and very mechanical. And some great pieces were written even in that style. Stockhausen, wrote some marvelous pieces. But anyway, I predicted that this would all come to a great breakdown, and it did. And guess what we have now? Another huge pendulum swing back to quote unquote C major and minimalism. That happened in the 70s. So what I want to say about this, I consider this a very sad and deplorable story because there shouldn't be this extreme back and forth pendulum. Why can't we live together, and just do and suddenly the ins are out and the outs are in? I think it's childish and pathetic, and I have never participated in that because when I came into the music field as a teenager, late teenager, I was told more or less that you got to join one or other of these camps. And composers like me and Leon Kirshner and so on of that time, we said to each other, wait a minute, these are both great masters, Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Why should we have to make a choice? I want to learn from both, and we did. And so I wasn't into that, but that's how severe it was. These were warring camps at that time. And then, as I say, then it changed again in an extreme way, the other way around. And now, so many years later, we're sort of in a very eclectic state where all kinds of musics now exist, more or less in a friendly manner with each other. But I don't know that the minimalist movement has produced anything that's. I think the minimalist movement is in fact disappearing. A lot of the minimalist composers now, I kid them. I said, you're getting very maximal, And they say, oh well, I never was a minimalist composer anyway. So this is a sort of sad history of how these things develop. On the other hand, in the meantime, creating very often very great music of many different kinds of styles. So that fits. That's where Henry was in for a while, and then he was out, and now he's back in. I don't know. It was then that I met a woman, now come the funny part, with eyes that petrified my brain and sank into my heart. Why don't you laugh? It's funny that the vagabond you see could ever have a woman and expect her to love for me. Ruined that.
That's okay. Start again.
The whole thing?
Sure.
Yeah. It was then that I met a woman, now comes the funny part, with eyes that petrified my brain and sank into my heart. Why don't you laugh? It's funny that the vagabond you see could ever have a woman and expect her love for me. But it was so, and for a month or two her smiles were freely given, and when her loving lips touched mine, I thought I was in heaven. Boys, did you ever see a girl for whom your soul you'd give, with a form like Venus de Milo, too beautiful to live, with eyes that would beat the Koh-i-Noor, and a wealth of chestnut hair? If so, it was she. For boys, there never was another half so fair.